Several years ago, I was watching an animated movie with my youngest daughter, who was 10 at the time, according to my notes, and it was entitled Happily Never After. And it wasn't your typical fairy tale, because in this movie, everything was turned upside down. The plot was simple. There was an old wizard who kept everything running smoothly in fairy tale land, and the prince got the princess, and everybody's wish came true, and everybody lived happily ever after. The prince found Cinderella's glass slipper. They got married. Rapunzel let down her hair. The prince climbed up it and rescued her. Sleeping Beauty woke up out of her apparent coma after being kissed by the prince. I mean, that's just the way it's supposed to be. Well, in this particular version, the wizard decided he needed to take a little vacation. He wanted to go play a round of golf for the afternoon, and that's when trouble started. His bumbling assistants created several accidents that caused the balance of good and evil to be completely reversed, and the stories were reversed. Cinderella never got to meet the prince after all. Rapunzel let down her hair and lost her balance and fell out of the tower and crushed the prince below. Sleeping Beauty, she's lying there, quiet and still, and her prince finally arrived, but when he bent over and kissed her, he fell asleep too. It was a great movie. I told my daughter, this is real life here, okay? Well, the truth is, we know that life is not a fairy tale. Happily ever after doesn't leave much room for the difficulties and stresses of life. Have you ever wondered why God allows things to pile up in your life? My wife and I have a running joke that things happen in threes, maybe for you as well. Just the normal stresses. One author wrote, like driving home from work after a terrible day at the office in bumper-to-bumper traffic. The guy behind you bangs into you, causing you to hit the car in front of you, and it happens to be a brand new Porsche. Several hours later, you have everything documented by the police officer, even though the Porsche owner is threatening to sue you. When you finally get home, you realize to stop and get milk. The dog's hungry, is gnawing on the cabinet. The kids are fussing, gnawing on each other. The mail delivers an overdue bill you've forgotten about, and you're out of money for the month. That night it rains, and the roof begins to leak. The next day, the Porsche driver sues. We love fairy tales because they present a life that we would love to experience, even though we know reality is very different. Another author put it rather humorously. He says, do you remember thinking how great it would be to start a family? Have that little chunk of love cooing at you from her crib in that newly decorated nursery? Everything is organized and clean and ready. But then the baby arrives after 48 hours of labor. She then refuses to nurse and then develops colic so badly she won't stop crying for 6 months. She finally falls asleep and wakes up 13 years later as a teenager. Now what? No offense to teenagers. I was one once. My mother's in heaven. She's still, I'm sure, getting rewarded for her effort. What about more severe discouragements? The kind where suffering lingers. Despair doesn't disappear with the kiss of a prince, or some perfect antidote, or some windfall. What about suffering that God chooses to weave into your life without any end in sight? The truth is, we like our heroes of the faith to suffer, but not too long, not too much. We don't really linger over passages where Moses and Elijah, two that came to my mind, cry out to God to end their lives. Now they're not threatening to take their lives. They want God to do that. In unvarnished terminology, they want God to kill them, to put an end to their suffering, the pressure, the misery. Now, heroes of the faith aren't supposed to talk like that or think like that. So we don't typically spend much time there. We tidy up that chapter in our mental record of their biography. We focus on the heroic stand of Charles Spurgeon, famous British pastor. But we gloss over things he says, like in one of his sermons where he said, "I am the subject of depression, so fearful that I hope none of you ever get to such extremes of wretchedness as I do." In preparation for the message today, I thought of Job. Couldn't help but think of Job. He is perhaps the epitome of human suffering. We love Job chapters 1 and 2. Isn't it a great setup? Satan comes behind the scenes. He's identified Job as a godly man, and he presents to God, as it were, this threat. If you take that hedge down, he'll curse you. Of course, we know very well, even as that temptation increases and the suffering, his 10 children die. He loses his businesses. He goes bankrupt. But he falls on his face and worships God. And then we skip from chapter 2 to chapter 42, where Job's health returns. He has 10 more children, and we think, isn't God good? Man, I'd like to be Job. We skip 39 chapters of pain and doubt and anger and suffering and confusion, which make chapter 42 meaningful. I don't know anybody who's memorized anything from Job chapter 3, where his anguish begins to grow. He never cursed God, but he cursed his life. Who's going to memorize chapter 3 and verse 3, where Job says, "Let the day perish on which I was born"? You could paraphrase that to read, "I wish I had never been born." You're not going to put that verse on your coffee mug. You're going to memorize that. Job says in chapter 3 and verse 26, "I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet." You're going to frame that and put it in the church lobby. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. You might hang that down at the nursery department. It'll work there, but not here. By the time you get to chapter 16 and 17, he's teetering on the edge of insanity. His anger and frustration increase. His counselors are convinced that Job is suffering because he sinned greatly against God. We know that he suffered because he was faithful to God. But now his confusion just sort of boils over. Well, we studied this book as a congregation, according to my notes, about 17 years ago. Hard to believe it's been that long, but we learned from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that his wife had cut her hair and sold it to buy food to survive. Their extended family had deserted them completely. They'll show up in chapter 42, which is sort of a humble apology on their behalf for misjudging them. Eugene Peterson paraphrases chapter 16. I don't want to put it up on the screens. I just want you to listen to Job. God, you have wasted me totally, me and my family. You've shriveled me up like a dried prune, showing the world you're against me. My gaunt face stares back at me from the mirror, a mute witness to your treatment of me. People take one look at me and gasp. They slap me around and gang up against me, and you just stand there and let them do it. I've sewed myself a shroud, and I wear it like a shirt. I lay face down in the dirt. My face is blotched red from weeping. Look at the dark shadows under my eyes. I've never hurt a soul, and my prayers are sincere. There's got to be someone in heaven who knows the truth about me, in highest heaven, some advocate who can clear my name. My spirit is broken. My days used up. My grave is dug and waiting. You talk like that. You suggest to someone that this is an example of honesty before God, bringing your doubts and disappointments and frustrations openly before Him like this, and they're going to wonder about you. They're going to wonder if you've been skipping your quiet time. What do you think of God? The truth is, we have all wondered at times, not if there is a God, but if God is really like this. Read the Psalms. Hear the transparency of someone suffering rejection and fear and disappointment. David asks God in Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" You ever wondered that? What about Psalm 88? That's called by Bible scholars perhaps the most discouraging psalm of all, because it never resolves. It ends without a word of hope. It instead ends with the words, "Darkness is my closest friend." What happens when life doesn't seem to resolve, when suffering never ends until death delivers the believer home, where heaven resolves it? We'd rather it end here in resolution. What if it doesn't? What if it is only in heaven where the broken pieces are put together? With that, I give you this legacy of light. This is the biography of someone you've perhaps never heard of. While he was one of America's most effective missionaries in the 1800s, in fact, he was the very first American missionary sent to Nigeria in 1850. His legacy was buried out of embarrassment over the way his last years unfolded. Only in recent years, with a better understanding of medicine and mental illness, this missionary is now being viewed in our lifetime entirely differently. And he's being honored. Biographies and blogs are now being written about his courageous efforts to open Central Africa, the country of Brazil, to thousands of missionaries who will follow in his footsteps. His name was Thomas Jefferson Bowen, born on his family farm in 1814 in Jackson County, Georgia. By the time he was 22, he was enlisted as a soldier. He loved that life. He served as a Texas Ranger during the Texas War for Independence. His dream was to be a general one day and find his career in winning battles for his country. One day, under conviction of the gospel that he had learned as a child, he wrote in his journal, "But what if I rose to become the greatest general of the age, but do not know the status of my soul?" He soon surrendered his life to Christ, as our brother did who was recently baptized today. He began preaching to slaves in Georgia. Felt the Lord calling him to be a missionary to the toughest place he'd heard about, the unreached people in the uncharted region of Yoruba, which is now modern-day Nigeria. He was single, traveling with another missionary, along with a slave from Georgia whom he had purchased and then set free. When they arrived in Yoruba country, there was no written language at all. It was completely uncivilized. Warring tribes were fighting one another. They would sell their captives to slave traders from the West. In fact, his military experience surfaced. He organized the citizens of one town to stand against Dahomey warriors who were coming to capture them and sell them to the British. They won the battle. And then Thomas negotiated a treaty with the British to end the slave trade in this region and open it to missionaries. Given these victories, the Nigerians, the Yorubans, now knew that he cared about them. He dedicated his time to writing a grammar, a dictionary of the Yoruba language, volumes, by the way, that would be used for the next 100 years. Instrumental in educating that nation, Bible translations that would follow. He would write a 359-page book, which I have, called Central Africa, in which he wrote of his missionary explorations, including the geography of the land, even the animals, the customs, the people, the vegetation. Because of his later years, as I'll explain, he was doing this while David Livingstone was doing something similar in this nation, but he was forgotten. Livingstone was heralded. It wasn't long before Thomas became ill with malaria and other diseases. One biographer wrote this: "All the diseases that killed most of the other missionaries left him alive, but physically and mentally maimed for the rest of his life." Exhausted, he returns to the States. He actually speaks before Congress, and he asks them for $25,000 to explore along the Niger River. The Senate agreed, but the House of Representatives did not. But while raising awareness of Central Africa and recruiting missionaries, all this time his health is declining. He marries a woman named Lorena, a committed believer from Georgia. Together they return to this difficult region to serve the Lord among the Yoruba people. They had only one child, a baby girl. They named her Mary Yoruba Bowen. Within months, their baby died. And Thomas's wife describes in her journal the awful stillness in their African hut after their daughter's death. By this time, Thomas is experiencing even more effects from his diseases. One modern missionary wrote that we cannot imagine the pain that malaria alone creates in the nerve endings. We have supported for many years a missionary couple, the wife who suffers from malaria, who was told that if she goes back, she'll never get any better, and she's gone back. I can't imagine that kind of courage. In recent years, physicians have examined the medical records and descriptions of his symptoms and have concluded that Thomas had Gambian sleeping sickness, worms, typhoid, malaria, parasites. They wrote, the parasites in his brain were seasonal, and when they rode through their life cycles, he would grow worse physically and mentally. Now, the prescribed common medicine in these days for pain in Thomas's world was called laudanum. Maybe you've read some biographies and you know that word. We call it opium. It was a liquid preparation of opium and codeine mixed in alcohol. It was the common prescription in the 18th and 19th centuries as a painkiller, a cough suppressant, even for insomnia. Just a few drops would be normal every so often, but only for a season. And many people in his days had become addicted. People like Samuel Coleridge, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, William Wilberforce, Charles Dickens. The list goes on and on. This was the prescription. They didn't know its deadly effects. Well, even though his health is declining and his mental stability, he's suffering depression, insomnia, pain. He accepts a commission to go to Brazil and open that country, to pioneer it. And he agrees, Lorena with him. Shortly after arriving, however, Thomas is accused by the Roman Catholic Church of being a spy. And though he opens this country, he's jailed in these initial days. The U.S. War Department was contacted, and the American fleet anchored nearby threatened to bomb the city if they didn't release him. And they agreed. He worked hard, but not for very long, until he lost his grip. Today, we know that laudanum's side effects can be hallucinations and mental derangement. His wife writes that while in Brazil, he began to lose that mental sanity. They didn't know why. In the meantime, by the way, the Smithsonian Institute publishes his book on Central Africa, and it becomes a bestseller, to which he gives the money away for the cause of missions. He'll die penniless. With his breakdown apparent to everyone on the field, his wife borrows money to bring him home to Greensboro, Georgia. He checks into an insane asylum for help, and he's released, but his health is not restored. The continuing effects of laudanum never allow him any relief or mental health. He begins wandering erratically around Georgia like a vagabond, like a drug addict. You might even see today on the corner of some intersection, begging, their minds gone. Thomas will check himself into these asylums 7 times over the course of 14 years. Because of these final years, he's going to be forgotten. His legacy will be buried out of confusion and misunderstanding and, frankly, a lack of medical knowledge that we have today. Although misunderstood, maligned for his vagrancy, his wife, Lorena, remained steadfastly with him, helping him as best she could whenever he would return home during frequent stays in mental hospitals. When Bowen was admitted for the 7th time in 1875, he passed away. There was no fairy tale ending, no chapter 42 for him. Shortly before Thomas died, in a lucid moment as a patient, he wrote a poem. It was an attempt to apologize, as it were, for his rather strange behavior, which he knew was strange. the disappointment he knew he was to so many. But the poem reveals the depth of his greatest wish, and it's convicting. Here's the poem. He wrote to the church at large. Dear brethren, unto you and God, my sins and follies I confess. Dark are the paths which I have trod, and full of pain and wretchedness. Full well I know I never can climb to the point where once I stood. I ask it not of God or man. My sole desire is to be good, and being good, to be once more a useful servant of my race. Not useful as I was before, but now simply this, useful as an evidence of grace. He had no idea until he reached heaven of what God used him to launch in only 5 years before he lost his mental grip. Today, there is Bowen University in Nigeria. There is Bowen Teaching Hospital. His efforts stopped the slave trade. His grammar and dictionary used for 100 years to help settle and educate the country. By the way, in that country, he has been revered and beloved. Statue of him at the university. But they still can't find his grave. Because of lack of finances, apparently the lack of understanding of the church, he was buried in the cemetery of that insane asylum in an unmarked grave. During his ministry, he wrote a letter to a friend where he said, "The labor is difficult and the fruit is slow to come, but we must sow in faith, trusting that the harvest is the Lord's." And again, he won't find out, but he had no idea when he finds out later of the harvest. He had no idea that the church that he started would become the home of the future Nigerian Baptist Convention, now with 20,000 churches and 10 million believers. I want him to be a legacy of light when you go through the darkest places. Will we follow a God who weaves suffering into the story? Will you give God that right today? Will you trust him? Wait for him. Worship him. What is the promise of God to you and me? Whether it's the stress of rush hour traffic or a busy household or a ministry assignment, a difficult assignment, a physical pain that won't go away. Well, the Apostle Paul would understand, and he speaks for the Lord who fully understands. Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians 4:16. I love this text. Convicting, though glorious. He writes, "For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. The things that are unseen are eternal." Now back up. Light, momentary affliction. Really? You know something about Paul. If you're older in the faith, nearly stoned to death, beaten often, imprisoned often, shipwrecked several times, rejected by his nation, hunted by his former religious associates, criticized by churches he planted, ignored in his final days while he waited in Rome to be executed. His associate had to find him. The church didn't even know where he was. Forgotten. Paul, what do you think about everything you've suffered? He would say, well, I have two thoughts. It was light. It was light. Yeah. Well, you have to compare it to the weight of glory. Light compared to the weight. It's beyond comparison. And then secondly, he says, it was momentary. Momentary. It lasted most of Paul's adult life. No. It was momentary when compared to eternity. Light compared to the weight of glory. Momentary compared to eternity. That's your future. That's the last chapter in your earthly biography, and then begins an eternal biography. Just keep in mind, beloved, that your biography is not finished. For every one of us, volume 1, our earthly biography, is actually going to morph into volume 2, so that you could end volume 1 with the words, and they lived happily ever after. Because you will. It's the beginning of volume 2, when the Lord sets everything right. This is when the Lord makes every sacrifice seem light when compared to the glory of heaven. Paul had seen heaven in his personal tour. He had seen it. He knew no matter what he suffered, he wrote, it's nothing. It's momentary, a moment in time. I mean, what's 80 years compared to 80 billion years? Your beloved Prince will one day call you to himself, to his royal palace, the celestial city. We can't imagine that. So in the meantime, let this legacy of light shed some light in those darkest days. And then one day, I'm already looking forward to meeting Thomas Jefferson Bowen.